Okay, so next up, we're going to talk on a topic that's a big challenge, but also a big opportunity for business, engaging key stakeholders on purpose. There's a plethora of studies that point to increasing numbers of society wanting businesses to act with a greater purpose, and they will vote with their wallets, as we actually have heard through a number of discussions earlier today. And our next panel will share new data, best practices, and ideas on how to effectively engage customers on this. So joining us now, we have one of our lead event partners, Public Good, and their representative is Melissa Anderson, president and co-founder of Public Good. It's a 45-minute discussion, or 42-minute discussion, sorry, and they're here to answer some of your questions. So do get them in using the Q&A box to the side of the stream. But now it's my pleasure to hand over the virtual stage to you, Melissa.
Great. Thanks so much, Liam. Really appreciate it. I could not be more excited to moderate this very important discussion today with a group of context on me. I'm an entrepreneur, and more importantly, like all of you here today, I believe in companies leading change. As a co-founder of Public Good, we are passionate about the opportunity for brands who are working on the public good to empower people to take action alongside them on things that they care about. This both creates more impact around the issue and drives brand equity, which, as we know, is very important in both creating and sustaining the business case. So our discussion today is going to look at both changed consumer expectations in this moment and business ROI. So look, it's been a heck of a year, but a couple things have become clear. One is consumer expectations have changed, and not just that they're expecting companies to lead, but also they're expecting companies to communicate with them and communicate the good that they're doing on pressing issues. Edelman Trust study, 84% of people want brands to communicate what they're doing. Also, as we've heard on multiple panels throughout this event, customers are voting with their wallets. So our audience here today at the Responsible Business Summit is doing the good work. And I think this presents a massive opportunity for companies to elevate their initiatives and build market share by engaging their stakeholders. That said, these issues of racial justice and sustainability and climate change are not easy to navigate. So let's dig in with our panelists. So Liz, you lead communications for Nestlé, the largest food company in the world.
Specifically digital communications. For
digital communication, yeah. Great. And when COVID-19 kind of first closed the country down as we know it, most consumer brands kind of froze for a bit with their ad spending, with their communications. Can you tell me a little bit about what you did at Nestlé in that unprecedented moment?
Yeah, absolutely. So a lot of folks who are joining us might think of kind of the old candy bars when you think of Nestlé. You might not know Nestlé is actually in 97% of American homes. It's Stouffer's and DiGiorno and Toll House and coffee, Chameleon, Nescafe. It's a really wide range of products, and it's really core in the lives of our consumers. And I think especially for employees at that moment, remember what we were seeing at grocery stores in real time, and the idea that you couldn't take for granted going to a grocery store and having everything you need on the shelf at the beginning of that lockdown. And so it really brought, I think, a reminder of just how critical that purpose of food and food availability is to our employees, to our day-to-day work. And our community efforts at the beginning of COVID really mirrored that. Food is a huge part of public health. It's a huge part of the economy. All of these things that were kind of areas of fear and concern were something that we were really in a position to impact. So we had a long-term partnership. We've been working with Feeding America for about 25 years in the US around food donations and financial support and making good food accessible to families everywhere. And that was the real focus of our COVID response as well, with Feeding America, with No Kid Hungry, particularly with schools closing, and with Meals on Wheels, especially with the specific threat to seniors. in being able to go out and get the meals that they need. So around those partnerships was our real focus in kind of responding not to the kind of public health and infectious disease part, but to the part of the crisis that we knew and understood the best, which is the role that food plays in our security, in our families, and in our health. So that was really the focus for Nestlé. And at the same time, that was something we wanted to bring to our consumers and our communities to ask them to really join us in supporting those organizations.
Wow, that sounds really powerful. And love how you took kind of your core cause, which is food insecurity, and then really looked at what does this mean in today's moment with COVID. And can you tell me a little bit about, did you communicate that out? Did you let the public know what your work was and let them know about the partnerships? And if so, how did you do that?
Yeah, and there certainly was kind of a continuing dynamic within our own teams of wanting to make sure that we weren't being self-promotional, that we weren't making a much bigger issue about us, but finding the right way to connect and share what we're doing. And really what we found is that that's also what consumers wanted from us. They want to know what companies are doing, and they don't want to go looking for that information. They want us to tell them. So one partnership, of course, as listened as well, was with Public Good. That gave us the opportunity to not be talking just about ourselves and what is Nestlé doing, but what is the issue of hunger looking like in this moment? What does it look like for kids who may have previously relied on free breakfast or free lunch at school? What does it look like for families who don't have good grocery store access? So it gave us a chance to really make the issue forefront and to invite consumers to participate rather than just sticking to here's what we did and this is about us, but really putting a spotlight in a larger context on what was going on and the opportunity to impact in the food space.
Wow, yeah, that's really interesting. And if you don't mind me kind of reflecting, I remember your Public Good campaign last year was around food insecurity. It was very much donate, like this is how we're helping, we want to donate. And then the campaign we ran together in COVID was a meal finder, because what we saw was, everyone was really struggling financially. So it was less about how can you give, and it's like, how can you get help? And so that was a really great action as part of that action campaign. And yeah, I could see, you mentioned a fear of looking self-promotional and that data was really helpful kind of internally, but I can imagine it must have been difficult internally to pull the trigger. And I know we've talked about this before. I mean, like ultimately, how do you make the decision to do this? I feel like, no one had a playbook. Can you give us a little insight as to what that looked internally and how you were able to kind of get everybody over the fence to really being verbal about what you were doing?
Yeah, absolutely. And in some ways, I think it was really valuable to start with the acknowledgement that this is unprecedented and it's unprecedented for every company and every stakeholder. And it kind of stopped us from getting distracted, being like, what are our competitors doing here? Or what are our peers doing here? Because none of us knew what we were doing. And so that was a chance to really take it back to who we are foundationally and say, what's at our core? What do we need to be contributing? And kind of where do we add the most value? Let's not kind of try to get involved in the most direct kind of public health space that's not necessarily our capability. Let's find where we're adding value in food and bring it there. So there definitely wasn't a playbook, but the fact that kind of gave us all alignment from the beginning, that we knew there's no expert in COVID response communications in April 2020. Nobody has done it before. Nobody has it figured out. We don't need to worry that we're aspiring to what someone else is doing and trying to crack their code. We can go back to really what is core for us. How do we make the right difference for us and talk like ourselves and connect with consumers like ourselves and really go to the purpose and foundation of the company there.
I think that's extremely helpful insight, because I think it can become hard if you're a big corporation to benchmark and look what everybody else is doing. But you have the strength to say, hey, what does always matter to us? What are our values? It doesn't matter what the competitors are doing. What are we doing? So, well, great. Thanks for that. And second, I'd like to introduce Kim Davis, who leads DEI and many other things at NHL. So thanks for joining us today. Super appreciate it. I think hockey, like several industries here, is really traditionally a white and male sport. And you lead DEI at NHL. So I would love for you to speak to a little bit more of what that looks like within that context and what the role of data has played for you.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa, and thanks for having me be part of this. So I joined the National Hockey League 3 years ago after a very long career in financial services and investment banking. And people often ask, like, what's the connection between that background and the sport of hockey? And I often reply that the connection is, industries that have or are currently going through significant change. A couple of years ago, the sport of hockey celebrated its 100th anniversary. And instead of looking back, it began to look forward on what would the next 100 years have to mean for the sport, particularly as the sport thinks about the world of not only sport, but entertainment. And one of the things that the sport of hockey has become keenly focused on are changing demographics, particularly across North America, and what that's going to mean to not only our current fan base, which is about 75% white and 25% non-white, but more importantly, our fans in waiting, as I refer to them. Those fans, particularly of the millennial and the Gen Z generation, who are already majority minority, how are we going to create an environment that's welcoming to those audiences? And so the work that I lead is really about how do we look at the work of hockey and the sport of hockey through the lens of growth and opportunity, and not the lens of charity and just community. Understanding that community should be a catalyst for our ability to build stronger, more substantive and authentic relationships with both fans and fans in waiting. But we have to think about that through the lens of growth. So the moment with George Floyd and the murder of George Floyd was really just an acceleration point for work that we've been doing literally for the past 2.5 years in readiness, getting our culture ready for the kind of change that's going to be required at every rung of the hockey ecosystem. And I think what's interesting about the NHL, different than other sports, is that it really influences every level of hockey, from youth hockey all the way up through the major minors and to elite and professional hockey. And so we have a unique opportunity to be both bold and courageous leaders in this quest to make our sport more welcoming and to make our sport more diverse.
That's really helpful. And I love how you talked about it didn't change anything, but the murder of George Floyd really became an acceleration point. And how do you think, I know we've talked about this a lot in the past, how do you think we can create sustained effort? So that was a moment in time, it's been accelerated. How can we together, and how will NHL plan to keep that momentum, so to speak?
Yeah, we have been really going deep from the very top of our organization with our owners down through every single level of our clubs and the entire hockey ecosystem. As I mentioned before, influencing not just the league and the clubs, but youth hockey, our fans, our influencers. And we're doing that by helping people interrogate their own models of how they're operating in this world of anti-racism, frankly. And there are 3 things that I've been focused on, starting with our owners. And the first is, how do we become stronger and more courageous leaders by being more vulnerable? If we can't build a level of vulnerability, then we aren't going to be honest about where our blind spots are. So we've been having these series of courageous conversations and uncomfortable conversations, starting with our ownership, that has really opened up a different level of dialogue, and really all rooted in people wanting to live their values, but understanding what does that mean in terms of how you have to show up individually. The second piece is around self-awareness. It's like, I believe that who you are is how you lead. And so, I think one of the greatest barriers to being a strong and courageous leader is not fear, but it's how we respond to fear. And so, COVID is a moment where we could all sort of wrestle with fear and like, what is that going to mean in terms of us being more innovative and creative and think out of the box post-COVID. And so that self-awareness piece is something that we've been talking a lot about. And then thirdly, what personal skin in the game are people willing to bring to the table? I think when we talk about being strong leaders in the quest, at least for hockey, for us to make our sport stronger and more welcoming, you have to be willing to put something on the line and to have some personal skin in the game. And so we've really been challenging leaders across the NHL to talk about, how can we be more vigilant in creating a culture, not only where people feel safe and respected and heard, but what does that mean in terms of what you have to give up? And that's really how we've been leading this conversation up and down the hockey ecosystem.
Wow, that's incredible. And it's interesting how this theme is emerging, around fear of looking self-promotional. How do you respond to fear? And I think that that's a really poignant, word for 2020 and the multiple things that we've all been facing together, both personally and as businesses.
Yeah.
So I would like to introduce Randy next before we turn to group discussion. Randy, you're co-founder and chief brand officer of Bombas, high growth, mission driven from day one, sock and apparel company. Randy, people love your product. I'm wearing Bombas socks now, and I think I tell you that every time we talk. So
I love it. I love hearing that, always.
Yeah, and Chris had him on yesterday. I'm not sure if you're in Bombas again today. I know you got you there. But anyway, I bring that up because you've got a great product, right? But I have seen you really put your mission forward in your messaging and in your marketing. And I was hoping you could talk a little bit about how you balance that kind of product message in your marketing as well as the mission message in your marketing. And are you measuring this? Are you justifying it with data?
Yeah, I mean, all of the above. I think for us, we talk about the product and we talk about the mission. Since day one, really, those have been the two foundational elements of our business: a commitment to give back to the community where we all work and live, and a high quality product. And for our business, I don't think we would have success with our mission if the product wasn't great and people didn't trust us and come back a second time. And I don't think that the other side would work either. So both things need to sort of be operating at a high level. And we've sort of built in some tension on the team around what comes first, the mission messaging or the product messaging, and what works. And making sure that if something is taking the lead and the product messaging is showing up without any sort of mission messaging, that we're checking ourselves, and the creative team and the marketing team and the brand teams are having a conversation around this, and making sure that we're having that conversation, I think, creates better creative, and it strengthens our commitment to the way in which we give back and the infrastructure of giving that we've built over the past 7 years.
Got it. And can you tell me a bit about your response to COVID-19 and the murder of George Floyd? How did this impact that machine of mission versus product? How did it affect your communications, your marketing, your messaging? What changed?
Sure. You know, what changed, I think, was cadence and like attention to tone. But what I think we realized in the early days of COVID was our mission wasn't going to change. The way that we were giving back wasn't going to change. The need for product in the homeless community certainly wasn't changing. So our obligation was as strong as ever, maybe stronger than ever. I mean, oftentimes in times of crisis, those who have the least need help the most. And that certainly was true during COVID, and it's certainly true with the homeless community. So making sure that people who were still operating organizations and shelters were getting products, and that we were communicating around how those shelters, organizations, groups that are our giving partners were working and how we continue to support them in that moment was really important. And it was important not only to close the loop for our customers and make sure they knew where that work was going and what was happening at that time, but also as sort of a rallying moment for our team. I mean, as you can imagine, people who come to work at a company like Bombas are very interested in having an impact, and having something stable in that moment that related to the purpose of our company and the original idea of why we existed, and being able to pressure test that infrastructure and realize that it was solid and that we didn't need to really change anything, just maybe move up or over communicate a little bit around the mission at that moment. That's what changed. It wasn't the message that changed, it was the frequency of the message and the reliance or importance of it, I guess. And yes, we do measure with data. I mean, we were looking at our messages so far this year, just in our email channel, around our community efforts. And, you know, at this point last year, we had sent about 8 or 10 messages just on email around this. And this year so far, we're already at 35 plus emails around our mission. So it's not new subject matter, it's just the way and frequency in which we're communicating.
Makes sense. And that's definitely been a common theme that we've heard, is that nothing has changed, it just made it that much more important. And I love the word you used about over communicating. That's great, that this is a time for sort of over communication, and that's what the data is showing us. And I've also noted that this year, Bombas has been given more opportunity for people to join you in helping, whether that be with your partners or people experiencing homelessness. And that feels like a shift. Can you talk a little bit about what caused you to move into that kind of creating a movement space?
For sure. I think in terms of some of our peer companies, this was an interesting opportunity for us. When people wanted to donate product earlier this year or had excess product, whether that was sheets or masks or other things outside of socks, they came to us, companies that we had worked with in the past, and said, how do we donate product? And, you know, what are some of the regulations around shipping to different places? And, you know, how do we physically do this? I think that's a challenge and a hurdle for some companies. And we were able to tap into our infrastructure of giving, our network, and donate products on behalf of companies who are interested in getting products to the organizations, the giving partners that we work with. So being able to open up that network to other companies was a bit of a shift, as you said, and like a nice moment for us earlier in the year to be leading, not just for our employees and for our supporters, but for other companies and peers that we work with. We did an event a few years back called 60K Day. And the idea of that event was to highlight the fact that on any given night, 60,000 men, women, and children experience homelessness in New York City. We wanted to bring together companies who care in New York to help out with that, partner them with different organizations and shelters on one night, donate 60,000 pairs of socks, and create links between companies. And that was the beginning of those types of efforts for us. And, you know, COVID accelerated the work with peer companies to help tap into our infrastructure of giving.
That's great. Yeah, I mean, we're back to that word of accelerating. This has been a year that's been tough,
sure.
but it has accelerated a lot of good work. And that's a good transition to introduce Chris Miller from Ben & Jerry's, a well-known born in activism brand with a powerful hippie-founded story. Chris, we understand that your activism and purpose work is all about the values of Ben & Jerry's. But I was wondering if you could also share any data or findings that show an ROI to that approach.
Yeah, well, thanks, Melissa, for hosting, and I'm super pleased to join Kim, Randy, and Liz today. So as you know, our company was founded 42 years ago by, as you noted, two sort of counterculture hippies who were really sort of part of a first wave of rethinking the role of business. And I think, you know, fairly soon after Ben & Jerry's started the company, they realized that the company could be more than just sort of a quirky, fun ice cream company, but the company really could be a tool to advance their values and this idea of progressive social change. And so that started what has been a long history of really using the brand and our connection to our fans and consumers to engage them in being a part of these campaigns that we run that seek to address some of the root causes that our societies face. And I'm super fortunate. So I sit on the social mission team at Ben & Jerry's. My background is in policy and advocacy. I don't have an MBA. I'm not a marketing guy. I've spent my career in mostly civil society. But I'm super fortunate to work with what I think is a fairly enlightened marketing team who understands that investments in the kind of advocacy campaigns we run, we've been working the last 4 or 5 years broadly on issues of racial justice, and more specifically in the last 2 or 3 years on the need to reform the criminal justice system, that spending Ben & Jerry's marketing dollars against strategies to reform our nation's criminal justice system does not compete with our need to sell ice cream. And so what we know, and I'll be perfectly frank with you, Melissa. I feel a little icky talking about this sometimes because I think no part of this work for us is about the kind of ROI that we see on this work, but I can tell you that it does, in fact, deliver several things. Typically, a sizable media spend focused on getting our fans or consumers to take an action in part of one of our campaigns has an ROI that typically betters the benchmark for the brand. So that kind of content performs better than just an advertisement promoting chocolate chip cookie dough. We often see, particularly when we are focused in particular geographic regions. We spent 2 years working in the city of St. Louis around a campaign to close a particularly retrograde prison. That kind of work we see delivers sales lifts in those communities. Again, it feels icky to talk about it in that way, but I think what is key for this is that when you design, in our case anyway, when you design these campaigns that are focused on driving impact, you have the added benefit of delivering ROI and lift on brand equity. I was just literally on a call before I joined you today to see some of our latest numbers that have shown a significant increase in the number of people over the last year that are connecting specifically with our work around racial justice. And I think, Ben had this insight so many years ago that the strongest bonds that you can create with your fans is around a shared set of values, right? I mean, it's Randy's story, it's all of our stories, that people want to be a part of something more than just buying more stuff. They want to be a part of connecting with these things that they care about in the world.
Yeah, I really appreciate you, especially bring up that kind of feeling of feeling icky. And it's worth kind of saying out loud that, we can all look to a day when you did good for good's sake. And there's the foundation sits on the side, and it's a long way from your marketing message. And it's tacky, it's in bad taste. You don't talk about that stuff. And that was really kind of the heart at what I, really wanted to push on today, which is that ultimately that's changed. Consumers want to know what you're doing. But then part two really is that if we as kind of impact individuals, and we're all working hard on our causes, can't tie business benefit to what we're doing, or said a different way, when we tie business benefit to what we're doing, we can create more good. We can reward shareholders and all the stakeholders and do more good when we can articulate the business case behind that. And so I've been sort of, evangelizing for the last couple of years this idea of let's talk about the business good that comes out of it so that we can do more good. And I think this year has certainly been an accelerant of that. And what have you seen since the onset of COVID-19 in terms of business growth and in terms of customer expectations? What's changed?
Well, as I'm sure Liz knows, it turns out that people who are spending a lot of time stuck indoors are eating a lot of ice cream, and I'm sure many other things. So, the company has seen dramatic growth, and that's wonderful. I think it's also true that there's a lot of need out there. There are, this, in addition to the global pandemic, we have seen, the last 6 months have in some ways been more tumultuous than we have seen in quite some time. And as we run up into this election, it feels like there's just a lot of work to do. So, we have had probably our biggest year ever in terms of engagement within our advocacy work. We've had more people take action with ourselves and our partners around this issue of criminal justice reform in the last year than we've had during any other year. And so, I think people are both hungry for ice cream, but I also think hungry to be engaged in addressing some of these, real structural issues that our society is wrestling with. And I think we see our role as helping our fans become a part of these movements and be a part of, addressing some of these big problems. And so it has been an accelerated year on sort of all fronts that are continuing that theme.
Wow. Yeah, and thanks for sharing that kind of hunger of people to sort of take action. I think a lot of companies are focused on the good that they're doing, but I know you've historically put a lot of effort into empowering people around action and creating movements outside of your walls. With that kind of very much movement focus, can you tell us a little bit about why it's important, not only because obviously it's benefiting the cause, but how it benefits the business as well? And sorry, I know for an activist, I'm throwing a lot of ROI type questions at you, but.
No, I think, look, I think we could be approaching sort of a tipping point here. You've talked about the Edelman study. We all are seeing across our businesses, consumer expectations are shifting. People are thinking differently about the role of companies and organizations in this moment. And I think this is likely not a kind of fleeting phase. I think this is, for better, for worse, increasingly going to be the future of commerce. And so on some level, while some of us are looking at ROI and able to point back to the fact that not only does this kind of work not detract or hold the business back, it's an accelerator. I think increasingly people, this tipping point is the companies that aren't engaging in this way are going to be lacking that ROI, are going to be left behind. And so I think we're getting to a place where perhaps the kinds of discussions we're having here today will be much more common, and the exception will be those kind of companies that are less engaged. Consumers are just expecting, and citizens are expecting it, and there is a real opportunity that our organizations and companies and brands have because of the connection that we have with our consumers, particularly at a time when these kind of traditional institutions that have lost both trust and confidence of citizens and people. And for better, for worse, that's a vacuum in which companies and brands like ours can step into.
Yeah, great. I appreciate that, Chris. And I can see a bunch of questions coming in from the audience. But before I start with those, I would love to just kind of hear everyone's kind of thoughts on what advice they would give the audience who will leave this and be kind of back to their work. Kim, let's pop back to you. What advice would you give the audience in particular in industry that tend to be less diverse? What advice would you give in terms of next steps around DEI?
Yeah, I think this is a moment to turn this into a movement, particularly for brands and for organizations like the NHL that haven't historically wrestled with a lot of the issues around social justice, racial justice. The vulnerability that I talked about earlier, is an important step in that journey. And sort of coming clean, as I often say to our leadership, about what we need to do to move forward and to turn emotion into action. Right here's the moment for us to do that, and for it to become a movement, and for it to be part of a sustainable way in which our sport is going to operate for years to come. So I would challenge those that are in the same space as the NHL to interrogate your own models, to really make sure that this isn't just a moment, and to look at every aspect of your ecosystem and to say, where can we do better? What can we do better? How can we be better? Yeah,
I love that. How can we be better? That it's really about a journey. I think a lot of brands sometimes will be afraid to speak out because they feel like they aren't perfect, and so there's fear of criticism. And that's a great segue to you, Chris, because I know we've talked about this quite a bit. And I can imagine that some people in the audience might be saying, well, we're not like Ben and Jerry's. We didn't have the hippie founders, but I know you and I have also kind of talked about how Ben and Jerry's isn't where it wants or needs to be from a sustainability, even from a diversity perspective, but you still get out there and talk about that a lot. So tell us about, we've talked about fear a little bit today, but tell us about how you think about fear of criticism, and what advice would you give there?
I think we're pretty comfortable with being uncomfortable. I think inherent in the work that we do is that there are people who agree with us, people who don't disagree with us. And to your point, we're not perfect. We have been strong and forceful advocates within society for the need to address the structural and systemic nature of racism, to reform the criminal justice system. And our company is headquartered in Vermont, which I believe is the whitest state in the nation, and our company looks very much like the community around it. There is a tension in those things, but I think, what we believe the role of corporations and companies is to reflect the values and things that they're committed to inside their company and advocate for societal level change outside their company. So if you care about climate change and you're working in your supply chain to reduce your emissions, we could shut this company down tomorrow and the planet's still headed over the cliff, right? We have to be a part of advocating for these wider changes outside the company. And when you do that, you open yourself up to criticism. I mean, and that's just true. But what I will tell you is, all the work we've done over the years, all the positions we've taken, whether it's in support of, one of the first companies in support of marriage equality, our support of the Black Lives Matter movement dating back to 2016, our call for, leaving fossil fuels in the ground, this company has grown year over year for 42 years, from a dilapidated gas station a mile from where I'm standing now to a global company operating in 40 countries around the world. So none of us need every person in the world to love our companies and brands. What we want to do is build strong, loyal, consumers that have affinity and connect with our brands in a deep way.
Really well said. Thank you for that. We've got a couple minutes here left for questions, but first, Liz, advice. You're in a huge company with lots of internal stakeholders. What advice would you give for kind of getting those stakeholders on board to be vocal about the good work that you're doing?
Yeah, I would say I'll have a bit of pragmatic advice to go with that, which is to say, know what makes an effective and persuasive case at your company. If that is data, use data. If that is, wherever you find those effective cases being made, use the tools you have to not take a no and create instead of a mitigation opportunity. If, for instance, Melissa, part of that conversation is, I don't know, I'm worried about looking self-promotional. Don't take that as a no, we're not stepping out on this issue. Look at how you can mitigate that and make the case around mitigating that. Let's not lead with ourselves. Let's partner with an organization with credibility. Let's lead with them. Let's penetrate with consumers in a way that empowers them and brings action to the audience. Look for those steps that can mitigate those concerns rather than letting any one of those concerns be the reason not to engage on purpose. Because just like you've heard from this whole group, that is where your audience and your consumers want you to be, no matter their demographics and no matter what issue might resonate with them the most. They very much want their companies to be there. So whether you're big or small, if you're big and you have your own data and insights on your consumers, you can pull in a partner that we work with on the data and insight side, Morning Consult, has unbelievable resources for free on their website around what do brands best kind of perform with consumers around action right now, whether that was COVID commercials or Black Lives Matter statements. Use the resources you have for whatever is going to make that compelling case internally, and customize it to your space and your leadership, because the story that works to tell at Nestlé won't be the same story that works to tell at Bombas or Ben & Jerry's or the NHL. Really, the same way we know our external audience and want to connect with them, know your internal audience. Don't be afraid to take up the issue. Be opportunistic where you see actions from your company that can make a bigger difference to bring forward. For us, that's been climate, equal pay, and where you have those opportunities, bring them forward. And then lastly, know what you do and know who you are. So a lot of those sustainability actions are things we do. What we do internally on D&I, on pay equity, on paid parental leave, are things we do that we're proud of and are very important. In times of crisis, we go to that core of who we are. So when you're not finding the route through, I think going back to that core of to your foundation, who you are, is something that could be really helpful in those internal dialogues as well. Kind of just strip away everything, get down to the meat of what's going to make an argument to your internal audiences. Don't be afraid to use data. That doesn't have to mean it's expensive, and bring it back to that kind of beating heart of your core identity.
Yeah, that makes a ton of sense. And I heard a sense of be tenacious there as well.
Yeah, there's a lot of that.
I think everybody on this panel has in common. Randy, as a co-founder, is there anything you would add to that in terms of influencing the C-suite?
Yeah, I mean, listen, this stuff has to be real. You have to believe it as a company, and I think thinking long term is super important, right? Like we want our grandkids to be wearing Bombas, and to do that, you have to be thinking about what's going to be important to your customers and customers that you don't have, and prospects 18 months in the future, 2 years in the future. If you have the luxury of being able to think ahead, create the company that you want to exist in the world. That's what the C-suite is there for. And their job is to build that leadership throughout the organization, empower people within the organization to bring ideas that surround the core values and enhance who you are as a company. And everything should be about the values of the company and how that interacts with the world at large. And that's the C-suite's job, is to foster those values within the organization. Great.
Well, I'd love to jump to a quick audience question before we run out of time. I know we started a few minutes late, so maybe we'll get a few minutes here at the end. So one of the questions from the audience is great. How do you ensure you look genuine when communicating on purpose? Who wants to jump in?
I mean, listen, I'll jump in and just say that if you're not genuine, it will be very obvious to everyone. that people have a strong filter for this today, thankfully. So, I think with marketing messages or anything you're putting out into the world, if it looks like marketing, that's the first way to say maybe something is wrong here. Communicate like you would to a friend, or understand what your tone of voice is as a company, and be on that level and be real with people, and don't commit to things that you can't back up with action.
And yeah, I'll add that, oh, sorry, please go ahead.
No, Liz, go ahead.
I'll add that in addition to kind of bringing that genuine through, think about what the clear intended action of seeing that communication is. If the clear intended action is, oh, it's very clear this communication wants me to think that like Nestlé's a good guy, or it's very clear that this communication intended action is to make me go buy Stouffer's mac and cheese, then that's not purpose-based communication. If the clear intended action is, this has connected me to an issue I maybe didn't even see in my own backyard, this has connected me to a nonprofit or a partner that I can contribute and make a difference. I think thinking about that action piece of it is a big part of kind of putting your money where your mouth is on being genuine and driving to an action that is truly purposeful.
And I just add to that, being consistent even when you don't get it right. Because sometimes you're not going to get it right, and people aren't going to be happy with the way you communicate, and you're going to get criticized. But I think consistency is where you build that trust, and then people believe what you're saying.
And I think a theme to add to that has come out of multiple conversations around creating a movement, around empowering people to take action. To the extent that communication isn't one way, this is what we're doing for purpose, and I'm tossing it over the fence, which does risk backlash. To the extent that it's a two-way relationship with consumers, to say, this is what we're doing, we're on a journey, we're not where we want to be yet, we're getting there, join us, let's do this together. That I think adds a lot of authenticity from a best practices standpoint.
No question.
Great. This is a similar question, but I think it is worth asking because it's different. There's been a number of instances where companies find a voice on an issue, i.e. LGBTQ ads. How can a company avoid this while still trying to step up?
I mean, I would just say, I think root whatever it is you're doing, and it's sort of reinforcing, I think, what everyone has said here. Root root that communication in something real and something tangible about who you are as a company, a brand, or an organization. And so I think, again, it's not about appropriating a value you think is your consumers or your fans, right? It's about sort of being willing to put yourself out on something that you believe. And I think, what consumers and citizens are increasingly looking for this kind of less virtue signaling and something more meaningful and substantial. So we've been longtime supporters of LGBTQ rights, marriage equality, et cetera, but simply turning one's brand rainbow around pride is probably in this day and age a little on the thin side. And so I think be willing to be a bit bold, be brave, and be willing to step out on something that is rooted in something real and that you believe. And I think, to Kim's point, be ready and be okay with, sometimes getting it wrong.
Well said. So I'm just going to take one final question for the audience, and then I think we need to wrap. But this final question is, when developing purpose, what external stakeholders did you engage to get their input? And I think this is a great question. We've been talking a lot about consumers and people. This is a session about stakeholders. So over to you guys.
Yeah, I'll kick that off because this is sort of new for us and really new for the culture of hockey to bring external voices into the decision-making process. We put an architecture in place about a year ago of councils and committees around 3 important stakeholder groups: our youth, our fans, and our players. And we now have 70 voices, very diverse voices from across our ecosystems, feeding into leadership ideas and points of view, many very different than the way we do things now. And we're decisioning and setting metrics and creating accountability around those voices. And so for us, that's how we're bringing voices into the decision-making process within the NHL that's going to have, I think, long-lasting effects on how the sport is seen, both by current fans and future fans for the long term.
Great perspective. Does anyone else want to add to that, the stakeholder piece?
It's many companies are reluctant to bring outsiders in because they feel as though they're not perfect or they will be criticized or exposed. And I think what Kim and NHL is doing is exactly right. We want to put our organization in service of those who have been marginalized, who are on the front lines of these issues, and we want to put our unique set of tools to work in service of those who are impacted by these issues. And so that's the trick. It's counterintuitive, I think, in many C-suites, but it is the most authentic, incredible way to engage on these kinds of issues.
To add on to that, I think there's also always somebody smarter than you are at the thing that you're trying to be great at. And being humble and open-minded about this is important for us. Like, our early research came from talking to members of the homeless community, right? And then our giving partners are a tremendous source of wealth for us and how to communicate and advocate for a community that we're trying to serve. So a lot of this starts with someone who seems like they're from the outside, and then eventually maybe those people are partners in your organization and they feel like the inside. So now we have a giving partner network, and they're part of our company as much as our employees are, or our customers, or even prospects. So I don't know, if you start with the approach that you're going to learn something, you're probably going to learn something, and it will make you a better company.
I love that. Well, a great way to sum up these last comments before we leave the audience is, don't let perfection be the enemy of good. I know I've heard that directly out of Liz's mouth and Chris in the past. So thank you, everyone, for joining us in the audience. Kim, Liz, Chris, Randy, thank you so much for carving time out and really being vulnerable and sharing what worked and sometimes what didn't and where your struggles were. I think that is so helpful to everybody here. So thanks so much, and we'll look forward to the next panel.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye,
you,
everybody.
Melissa.
Thank you.
Thank you, guys. What an excellent discussion. And yes, we're continuing on this theme on engaging consumers as we go into the next discussion. And we'll now look at the opportunities of ways to inspire sustainable consumer habits through purpose-driven partnerships. Joining us now, we have Anne Fink, President of the Global Food Service PepsiCo. And Anne was talking to our very own Terry Slavin, Editor-in-Chief, Sustainable Business at Reuters Events. Over to you, Terry.